Bill, can the existence of God be demonstrated?
Well, I think that depends on what you mean by a demonstration, Robert. I don't think that you can demonstrate God's existence with mathematical certainty that will convince everyone.
Or make him appear right here.
Right. But I do think that there are good arguments for God's existence. There are good reasons to believe God exists.
Now, we've had reasons for millennia about God's existence, so I really am interested in your feeling of what are the best of those arguments that you're comfortable with today.
Well, one of the most appealing arguments to me personally that I find convincing is the cosmological argument for God's existence.
And what does that consist of?
Well, this is a family of arguments that tries to show that there is a first cause or sufficient reason for the existence of the world.
So everything has to have a cause?
Well, not everything that exists has to have a cause, but I would put it this way. Anything that begins to exist has to have a cause. Anything that comes into being must have a cause. And this is rooted in the metaphysical idea that being cannot come from non-being. Out of nothing, nothing comes. So if something comes into being, there must be a cause which brought it into being.
So the only thing you would exclude from that is God himself.
Well, I wouldn't exclude God from this, but I would say God never began to exist. In other words, what this argument will get you to is an uncaused, eternal first cause that never came into being.
And that's God.
Right.
Okay.
And so the key premise here will be to demonstrate that the universe began to exist, because if the universe began to exist, then it follows logically that the universe has a cause.
And that's the cosmological argument. What else?
Well, there are other versions of the cosmological argument that don't depend on the universe having a beginning. For example, the great German philosopher Leibniz asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And I think probably all of us have wondered about the mystery of existence. Why is there anything at all? And doesn't there need to be some sort of an ultimate explanation of reality? And I think that that's a very plausible principle, that everything that exists has to have some kind of explanation for why it exists until you get to an absolutely necessary being which is self-existent and not explained by anything outside of itself.
Well, people would argue that there are brute facts, which means it's there and you can't explain it.
I think that there may be brute facts, but I don't think that there are any brute things, that concrete objects, things that actually exist, don't just do so without an explanation. Things that are real, that actually exist, have their explanation in causes that produce them. Or if you're talking about abstract things like numbers and so forth, they exist by a necessity of their own nature.
All right, so we have again, cosmological argument has a efficient cause and you need a beginning.
Yes.
All right, what other arguments do you have?
Well, there's the famous teleological argument, which would say that the universe exhibits a complexity in its structure that cannot be attributed plausibly to either chance or to physical necessity, and that therefore this is best explained by saying it's the product of intelligent design.
And teleology means that from first happenings you project some sort of an end result.
Yes, it's the idea that there is an end in mind for which things exist, and so things are literally designed. And
so the teleological argument is the design argument.
Right, that's right. And new life has been breathed into this argument by the discovery of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, which doesn't seem to be explicable on the basis of physical necessity, because these constants and quantities that are so finely tuned are independent of the laws of nature, and it can't be plausibly explained by chance because the odds against it are just so overwhelming that it seems rational to think that the reason the world looks designed is because it was designed.
What else do you have in your bag of tricks of arguments?
Well, there's the moral argument for God's existence, and this would say that if there is no God, then there really are no objective moral values and duties. On this view, unless there is God to serve as an anchor point for moral values and duties, moral values and duties are just the products of socio-biological evolution. And on this view, without God, everything is relative. Human beings are just relatively advanced primates, and moral values are just something we've evolved to get along in society without killing each other off.
This argument to me sounds different in that you need to assume the absolutism of moral values. In the other arguments, you're assuming the reality of a beginning and a world, which I think everybody admits. But when you deal with moral questions, you have to make the assumption that there are absolute moral values as opposed to relative values.
That's right.
Because if you don't have absolute values, then you certainly don't need God.
I prefer to speak of objective moral values, by which I mean mind-independent values. And you're right, that would be the second step of the argument, would be to say, but there are objective moral values and duties. That is a premise in the argument. And I think
that's an assumption.
Well, it's a premise. I don't think it's just an assumption. I think that there's no more reason to deny the objective reality of moral values than there is to deny the objective reality of the physical world.
Well, that's a strong statement.
Right, and any argument that you could give me for denying the objective reality of moral values, I could construct a parallel argument for being skeptical about the objective reality of the external world. If we trust our sensory intuitions that there is a world of objects independent of us out there, I don't think we have any grounds for distrusting our moral intuitions of the realm of objective values that we perceive.
Certainly, to verify the objectivity of the external world, we're dependent upon our senses. Everybody agrees with that.
And there's no way to get outside your senses
totally.
to prove you're not a body lying in the matrix being programmed to believe in something.
All agree with that. But when you get to moral values, that's different. That's not an objective sense in the same way that everybody in every society in the history of the world would have had that same view of this chair or this carpet. I mean, they would know it's there. But if you deal with moral values, different societies have had different moral values.
Well, I think that's certainly true, though very often you will find there is a commonality among cultures that underlies the different cultural expressions of these moral values. For example, modesty is a common moral value, but what is considered modest in one culture rather than another may differ. Or, for example, cannibalistic tribes do believe in the ethic of loving your neighbor, but they don't consider people in other tribes to be their neighbors. So that while they wouldn't cannibalize their own tribal members, they would members of another tribe. So beneath seeming moral diversity, there is, I think, a common moral code.
I think there are some tribes
perceive.
that would practice cannibalism to ingest the wisdom of their ancestors.
Well, I think you would be hard-pressed to find examples of many tribal groups that cannibalize their own people.
All right, let's go on. But I think there's a difference between the moral argument and some of the others.
Yeah, I guess I don't think that's right. I mean, it does seem to me that we have good grounds for accepting our moral experience. When I talk to folks, 99% of people will say to me, yes, I think there is an objective difference between torturing a child for fun and loving that child and caring for it, that these are not morally indifferent acts. And I simply say, why distrust that moral intuition? We clearly perceive objective moral differences in the world. But if they exist, and that first premise is right, then it follows logically and inescapably that God exists.
I think that first premise is critical for the moral argument.
Yeah.
What else you got?
Well, that would be the argument that would be rooted in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. I don't think that any historian who is a purely naturalistic historian can give a plausible account of events like the death and resurrection of Jesus. I think we have here, in essence, a kind of argument from miracles for the existence of God. It may surprise most people, but the fact is that there is a majority of New Testament biblical critics who have come to believe that part of the portrait of the historical Jesus that is established by an examination of the evidence is that after his death, Jesus was buried in a tomb by a Jewish Sanhedrist named Joseph of Arimathea, that on the first day of the week following his crucifixion, that tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death, and that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Now, those are the generally, not unanimously, but generally agreed facts. And the question is, how do you best explain them? Well, I don't know of any naturalistic hypothesis that can explain those facts without bruising them. I think that the best explanation is the one the disciples gave, and that was God raised Jesus from the dead, and that entails that God exists.
I would think that's a rather lengthy set of premises to get to your conclusion, but I will leave that for you and,
right.
and go on to the next one.
Well, the next one would be the ontological argument. And this is the argument that the very concept of God, properly understood, implies that God exists. And the idea here is that God is a maximally great being. He is the greatest conceivable being by definition. But a greatest conceivable being would have necessary existence. He would be omniscient, omnipotent, morally perfect in every possible world.
And really existing.
Well, yes, in every possible world. And since this is a possible world, it follows that God must exist in this world, and therefore he exists. And I think that this argument is a sound argument for God's existence.
How about arguments that are personal, that you can't convince anybody else of, but that you feel?
Yeah.
I know people have them because many people
right.
talk about
well,
it, but are those philosophically legitimate?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that my belief in the existence of God is ultimately not rooted in these arguments. These arguments provide confirmation or reinforcement for my belief that God exists. But my belief that God exists is rooted in my personal experience of God. He's a living reality in my life and has been ever since I became a Christian as a teenager. And I think that's perfectly defensible. We spoke a moment ago about our knowledge of the external world. There's no way to prove that the external world exists. There's no way to prove you're not a brain in a vat of chemicals wired up with electrodes to think that we're here in this room having this conversation. Similarly, there's no way to prove that the past is real, that everything wasn't created 5 minutes ago with built-in memory traces and appearances of age. These are what philosophers call properly basic beliefs. They lie at the foundations of our system of beliefs. Now, these beliefs aren't arbitrary. They're rooted in experience, my experience of seeing and feeling and smelling objects and remembering the past and so forth. So these beliefs are grounded in experience, but they're properly basic beliefs to my foundational system of beliefs. And I would say similarly, the belief that God exists is, for those who experience him, a properly basic belief rooted in the experience of God himself. And in the absence of some overwhelming defeater or objection to belief in God, the believer is perfectly rational to accept that God exists, just as we are perfectly rational to believe in the external world or the reality of the past.
Well, most people's internal feelings about things are acculturated because of society or family or experiences or psychological benefits or problems that people have had. How can you depend upon something that is so emotionally based to root your deepest belief?
Well, I think that an atheist, to carry this argument, would have to show that there's a particular psychological profile that religious people have. And that just has never been demonstrated throughout the world. There isn't any sort of particular psychological profile that religious believers exhibit. They come from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of belief systems, all sorts of emotional and cultural upbringing. And so I think it would be very hard for the unbeliever to try to show that this experience of God is spurious or non-veridical.
But what you're saying, though, demonstrates that all these different expressions of people's belief are vastly different kinds of gods and religions and systems and doctrines and all this mished together. But you're pointing to some core commonality among all these superficial differences that somehow proves an existence of God, yet the God that those are all related to are all different.
Well, no, I wasn't appealing to that. I was thinking of people who believe in a traditional theistic concept of God, that they don't exhibit any sort of psychological profile. Freud attempted to do this by saying that it's the projection of a sort of father figure on the heavens due to an Oedipal complex. And that's been, I think, completely evacuated of any plausibility. So I wasn't speaking of pantheistic concepts of God or other concepts of God. That's an entirely different question. What I meant was that believers in the traditional concept of a monotheistic God don't exhibit any commonality in terms of their psychological upbringing or culture or profile that would lead us to think that you can say this is non-veridical.
And you, as a real individual, will rely upon that more than all the other arguments from science or philosophy.
Yeah, I would. I think that the experience of God, for him who has it, is a self-authenticating experience. It's something that's so real that it overwhelms the defeaters which are brought against it.